children having sex in foster homes. What's wrong with that picture? Today's guest, Howard Talenfeld, a nationally prominent children's rights lawyer, is going to answer that question and visit with you about the extent of this problem, because it's not just a Florida problem, it's a national problem. Today, you're going to learn all about the justice system and everything that's wrong with and broken in the system that is supposed to be looking after our children. Howard Talenfeld, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. My research indicates that you've practiced north of 40 years. You made the list of Forbes' top 200 lawyers in the United States, which I thought was hard-earned and well-deserved. And there's a tremendous amount of information about you on there because of all of the great victories you've had on behalf of children. But before we go any further, can you please speak to this situation with young children having sex in a foster home?
More than 25 years ago, I was shocked. I was appalled. I could not believe that a woman who adopted a 4-year-old boy came to me as an attorney to help her surrender this boy back to the system where he had been a victim of sexual assault. And she came because she found the 4-year-old boy penetrating her 3-year-old natural daughter. Now, I was shocked because first of all, I could not understand and believe that a 4-year-old could have penetrating sex with a child, any child. I was in shock. And then I found out when I started asking some questions and I spoke to some judges and others that knew the local Broward County child welfare system that this was a problem that was epidemic in nature. This was a problem that was going on to the point that we had data when we certified a class in a class action that I got involved in because of this appalling situation. We found out that more than 30% of the kids that were receiving mental health care in Broward County in the foster care class action had been victims or were sexual aggressors.
That situation in Broward County, is that true statewide? Is it also true nationally? Because I know that you handle and you're involved in matters across the United States.
The answer is in Florida, we knew from certain, even back 25 years ago, because we had data showing from the same company that had looked at Broward County. There was data showing that this was going on in varying percentages throughout Florida, but some counties, there were 30% of these kids had been victims or were sexually aggressive. In some counties, they might have been lower, 10 or 15% of the kids that came foster care had these problems. And I can tell you that outside of Florida, okay, we've had the same experiences. We've handled cases in New York, we've handled cases in California, we've handled cases in North Carolina, and in South Dakota, would you believe, where these problems have existed because, tragically, when kids are victimized by sexual perpetrators, by pedophiles, by anyone, it's a learned behavior. There's almost like a switch that sometimes goes off with some of these kids, and they become sexually aggressive. They have lots of other very serious problems too when they've been victimized at this young age. But a switch goes off, and tragically, these kids now can victimize other children, younger children, vulnerable children. And I can tell you, we found it out in class actions. We've seen it in data everywhere, and we know this is going on. But this is not a subject that the states like to talk about because they use the veil of confidentiality, and they cover the data on this because one of the most tragic situations is when a parent comes to me who lost a child and said, I didn't sexually abuse my child, but the system did. I neglected him. I didn't have money. I was poor. I couldn't get medical treatment sometimes. But I did not victimize my child and allow my child to be perpetrated upon at my house.
May I digress for one moment, and we'll come back to this. First of all, the 3-year-old child who was penetrated by this foster child, was that child the natural child of the foster parent?
Yes.
Okay. And in that setting, in foster homes, you're telling us this is a national issue and a national problem that continues to this day for reasons and failures that we're going to cover shortly. But it's a national issue?
Absolutely.
Okay. Back when I was practicing, I remember seeing some cases of this nature of improper sexual conduct between young children in other settings. Like I think daycare centers were the ones that I saw. Have you seen other backdrops, other contexts where this sort of sexual abuse has happened? And not even at the hands of adults, which we're also going to get to.
So they happen in schools, elementary schools, high schools. It happens in group homes. It happens in delinquency settings. It happens in any kind of congregate living facility that you can think of. And unfortunately and tragically, in places where we think our children are safe.
All of this begs the question of how did children that young even know about or learn about this? They're obviously not learning about it in schools. With that said, can you, as an example to illustrate, what turned out to be the story of this 4-year-old child? Because these were things that child obviously learned before he was brought into the foster home.
Yes. This was a child who was victimized by an older adult boyfriend of the child's mother.
The natural mother.
That's correct, before they went to foster care. And the mother's rights were terminated. The boyfriend evidently had been perpetrating the little 4-year-old. And this is the sad part of this. It's tragic because this happens frequently. This is one of the reasons why kids come into foster care or other congregate group settings. And then these kids learn these behaviors and they become sexualized. And when they become sexually reactive, sometimes, not all children, replicate these behaviors. And when they replicate these behaviors, they themselves become perpetrators, and the problem spreads almost. If it were mumps or measles or some other disease, COVID, we would understand it. But tragically, that this is a problem that can be epidemic by its nature because some children who are victimized will go on to victimize other children. And so it can start with adults, but can end up with what's called child-on-child sexual abuse.
And as you're saying that, I recall that another case that I looked at happened at an elementary school in a bathroom. And that's where that assault took place. And it just shows me that it's a widespread problem, not just limited to foster homes, which have a bad name anyway. But Howard...
Let me interrupt you
please.
Because these kids all go to school too. And the kids that are victimized go to school, and the bathrooms in schools and daycare centers and other places serve as a place that, unfortunately, these problems can replicate themselves as well. And so I can't tell you the number of times that I have gotten calls concerning children who were victimized in a bathroom in a public school because this is a spreading problem.
So not only, in my mind, you are not only a specialist and an advocate for children's rights, but you're also a champion. And I know you've been recognized as that. And I just think you're probably the most qualified guy to ask these questions of. Just saying, just throwing that in. I just want to ask you, before we go further, when it comes to the ways that sexual abuse affects young children, I know that in the lawsuits you bring and the cases you file, whether they're individual cases, class action cases, administrative cases, whatever, you, as the plaintiff, have the burden of proof. You have to prove the damages, how the damages are caused, where they come from. And so I take it that you have a lot of interaction in your everyday practice with mental health professionals, whether they're psychologists, psychiatrists, or other types of doctors. True?
Correct.
Could you try to explain in basic terms, for everyone can really understand what you're talking about, how, from a medical or psychological point of view, sexual abuse affects children?
It can affect children of any age in a number of ways. The first thing you can do is make them sexually reactive or responsive to sexual stimuli. Turn on the switch, the sexual switch, the one that normally only goes on in adolescence, can go on at a much younger age with these kids. And that makes these kids potentially dangerous to other kids in the system. And that's a problem we face, because then these kids have to live with what's called safety plans around them, where adults have to monitor their bedroom conditions, the bathroom conditions in the homes that they're at. They have plans in their school, what's going on in school, where somebody is monitoring these kids so that they don't, unfortunately, replicate these behaviors. And ultimately, at an old enough age, they become criminally charged and they have a criminal background that we can't save them from. And so the first issue is the sexualization of these kids who are victimized. Second kinds of problems that we see is things like post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, kids that become withdrawn, kids with anxiety issues. Because remember, when kids are in foster care originally, they're taken from their homes, okay? And they already are facing the trauma of the first trauma being the original abuse that they suffered at the hands of their parents. The second trauma is being taken away from the only parents that they've known. The third trauma is coming into a strange home with a foster parent, and that's difficult. But then you can get past that, and then when they're victimized in these homes, and these are the kinds of cases we handle at Justice for Kids at Kelley Kronenberg, but when they're victimized, again, they suffer another trauma, and they're very serious traumas, one after the other, that are overlaid on top of each other. And if we don't help these kids, they have not only serious psychiatric issues, they can be depressed, they can be withdrawn, they can have nightmares, they can have problems that you can't even imagine, socialization issues. Then they can start to react, and there's a full continuum all the way down to some of the worst diagnoses that we run into, which are schizophrenia and reactive attachment disorder. And these kids suffer along the continuum, one or more of these problems, unless we get to them early, try to help them with safety plans, try to help them with the right kinds of therapies. They're out there, and usually more likely than not, we can help them if we catch it early enough.
Sure. Although this type of extreme sexual trauma always leaves some residue with a child of some sort. I know that many, if not most of them, end up with lifelong psychiatric issues like PTSD. Others even worse, and some even end up dead. And you were sharing a story with me before we went on the air today about a child who went through hell and ended up actually committing suicide. Could you visit with our audience about that, please?
This is a very sad story. There was a young boy, and I can use his name because he's since passed away, and unfortunately, his tragedy has been in the newspapers. It's been all over the media, all over TV. Several years ago in Broward County, his name was Gabriel Myers. And Gabriel Myers was a victim of sexual abuse in his natural home, and he came into the foster care system. He came from Ohio to Florida, Broward County, Florida, and was placed in another home. It turns out he was victimized there. Folks didn't find that out till later. And he was placed on psychiatric medications as well, psychotropic medications, to try to address his behaviors. They were probably overused in his case, and caused a lot of other issues with him. And at the age of 7 years old, he hung himself in a foster home in Broward County, Florida. And that's the most horrific example, but we have kids at 7, at 9. Unfortunately, they become suicidal. The multiple layers of trauma that exist from sexual abuse cause and create these kinds of problems. The psych meds are used to try to control behaviors, but unfortunately, these are natural reactions, these behaviors, to trauma that they try to lessen with psychotropic medications. And we see very young children all the time that are on these medications, that are victims of abuse, that end up in psychiatric facilities, residential treatment facilities that are sometimes called SIP placements, because the behaviors become so out of control, because they become so frustrated and they can't deal with the initial harms of their initial abuse and subsequent re-abuse in care. And we have a system in Florida that has a waiting list for kids to be placed in residential facilities.
Is that true of other states as well, the waiting list situation?
And anticipating what you were going to ask me, The answer is yes. We have waiting lists elsewhere because we try to send, Florida sometimes sends these kids out of state. Many of them have been sent out of state to find the right kinds of facilities to meet the needs dealing with these kinds of traumas, to wilderness facilities. A lot of them end up out in Nevada, which has favorable licensure requirements. But these kids end up all over the country with serious psychiatric injuries. And there's waiting lists, and there's not enough money, unfortunately, to care for these kids to address their issues.
You mentioned earlier in passing, Howard, how the state, and probably all states, have some cloud cover that helps them keep these types of horrors and injustices under wraps. I know that in Florida, the Department of Children and Families, which is the state agency that's supposed to be overseeing all of this, have huge confidentiality concerns because, first of all, we're dealing with children. Second of all, we're dealing with medical and psychiatric issues, which are protected by HIPAA. But third, because they are supposed to investigate, and investigations are, by their very nature, confidential. And just from my past experience, I know it's like good luck getting anything out of DCF about anything that's going on, any complaint, anyone who they've investigated, any statements, any materials. Very hard, if not impossible sometimes, to get that. So first question, does that provide cloud cover for state officials and agencies? Because I take it this is one of those things that is not very politically popular when it comes out for whoever happens to be in charge.
So you're dealing with rules, statutory rules enacted by our legislatures throughout the country. They create confidentiality around foster care records for exactly the reasons that you said. They involve investigations of abuse and neglect that are highly sensitive areas. And so the agencies shield themselves with the cover of confidentiality, and they don't provide records. And so it's one of the reasons why these children need a voice. And I could talk to you a lot more about Florida Children's First, which is a charity that we founded 20-some years ago in Florida, which actually created legislation in Florida to at least allow foster children or children who come through Florida child protection systems to get their own records. Once upon a time, they couldn't get their own records in Florida even. And so now they are available, and yet they're still difficult to get because the agencies want to, I have to say, cover their asses because unfortunately, there's some agencies that believe that by admitting that we had a problem, they feel they're doing something wrong, as opposed to fixing the problem and recognizing that all we want to do is help these kids and help them as early as we can, not years later when it's too late to really help them.
But for states, for agencies, for everyone from the governor down to the people who are running these agencies and working in these agencies, it sounds like they really prefer to keep this as a dirty little secret, if you will. Has that been your experience?
There have been moments, I would say, in Florida's history where there are a few folks that got the job of being Secretary of DCF, like Bob Butterworth, wanted to see open records and wanted to talk about these problems, but I can tell you that is by far the very rare exception and not the rule. Most states do not want to talk about it because the folks that are in charge, whether it's a governor, a secretary, or a cabinet member of some sort, okay, they don't get reelected that way. When they talk about these agencies that are overrun with these problems, as opposed to exposing the problems and letting folks understand them and fixing the problems, because the only way you can fix something is if you understand it and you talk about it and you understand what the causes are. That's what true risk management is about.
Certainly. If I may digress for a moment, can you give us any idea how many children in Florida and nationally right now are in foster homes altogether?
I can tell you in Florida's child protection system that includes foster homes, it also includes relative homes, non-relative homes, other licensed facilities. Florida's got approximately 20,000 children that are in the system. Now, I haven't checked the national data recently, but I can tell you that New York is at 500,000. LA has been competing right behind New York City, and you can pick the rest of the states, and it's in the tens of thousands. Actually, I was just looking at the state of Oregon that's having very serious problems right now, class action litigation, and there's more than 5,000 kids in Oregon that are in these systems. And we've got millions of kids every year that are in these child protection systems in the custody that have been taken away from their parents, that have juvenile courts. Some have juvenile courts that are addressing the problems. Others doesn't reach the stage of going to court yet. But there's millions of kids throughout this country that are part of these child protection systems. And these systems, even though they're confidential, as you said, in terms of the way they operate the systems, it's so confidential that we as citizens don't realize when our children are being exposed to the problems that the children that are in the child protection systems already have, because they're in our schools as well. And so the reality is this is a very serious endemic problem that exists in this country, that is a spreading epidemic type of problem that we have not really gotten to the guts of in terms of solving these issues of how do you operate a safe foster care or substitute care child protection system.
What are the top 3 reasons, root causes, involving the parents or the environment where a child is, that lead to them being placed into foster care in the first place, nationally? What's going on that causes children to be taken from their parents, whether their rights are terminated or not, and to be placed into, whether it's foster care, group homes, or to be placed with relatives or grandparents, if they're fortunate enough to have people like that who are qualified?
I'll give you 3 of the very biggest because I haven't looked at the data to prepare for this, but
No, that's okay.
First of all, drug addiction. We'll start right there. So many addicts are also parents. And the problem is the addiction can be a permanent issue. It's a cyclical issue. And they have children. And parents are on a binge or using. They don't appropriately care for their kids. We have domestic violence. You asked me top 3.
Yep.
I'm going to try to give it to you.
Please.
Domestic violence is a huge issue that when you expose kids to domestic violence, that's a recipe for getting our child protection systems involved as well. And unfortunately, the fabric of our society has been unweaving for years. The traditional family kind of unit doesn't exist the way it once did, and so we see poverty, even poverty by itself, and parents who are just unable to care for, support their children because of economic problems, end up losing their kids to these child protection systems.
All tragedies, none of which have anything to do with the child. And some might say that if an adult is in a domestic situation or using drugs, that's a product of their own choice, and they own part of what ends up happening to them. That cannot be said for children, which is why they're so vulnerable, I take it.
At every age you can possibly imagine, including in utero, which is where so many of these cases come from. The mom's using during her pregnancy because she's an addict and she can't stop using, and she exposes the child to drugs which can impact them in terms of their development and create problems, another set of problems unto themselves. And the systems become involved in many of those cases, not all of them. They'll allow children who have parents who are addicts, who allowed them to be born drug exposed and drug addicted even. They'll allow those mothers to have kids.
Right.
And still, but the problem is when we see it resurface again and again in those same families where mother's on a binge, okay, if mother and father are on a binge and the children are neglected, unfortunately the kids end up eventually in the system and they become part of our child protection systems.
I know that alcohol is also considered a drug. Is that part of the drugs that you identified categorically
Absolutely.
as one of the top 3?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
As to other drugs, aside from alcohol, obviously we're old enough to know that over time, drugs and drugs of choice have changed. I remember 20 years ago or so when it was about cocaine, and then it turned to crack. And now, fast forward to today, we have all of these synthetic opioids that are not just even more, each one, it seems, is exponentially more addictive than the drugs before it. I read something about fentanyl, which has killed so many people and is so addictive that there are already other synthetic drugs that are even exponentially more addictive than fentanyl. Have you seen that show up in the data regarding children who come from homes with drug-addicted parents? Is it getting worse? Are you seeing more parents dying and playing into the situation that ends up putting the child into the foster system?
Well, the reality is it was a problem 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and it is a huge, explosive problem today. Because remember one thing about addiction. You can look. All you have to do is look at the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that psychiatrists rely upon. Addiction is something that changes an individual's brain, and they crave the drugs, and so addiction can last a lifetime. It's cyclical, and the old expression about alcoholism, on the wagon, off the wagon, is a reality with addiction and all of the modern day drugs that we're seeing these parents exposed to.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you're a member of the Kelley Kronenberg law firm.
That's correct.
It's experienced tremendous growth, has a unique business model. I happen to know some of the principals in that firm and also some of the lawyers. And I'm just shocked by how quickly they've grown, about their visibility and the quality of the lawyers that they have and the results in the clients. Now, that's what I see as an outsider. How is it working out at Kelley Kronenberg for you? Tell us a little bit about the firm and how you ended up heading up this division for kids.
I could have never imagined that I'd be at a law firm like Kelley Kronenberg, but they are an amazing state-of-the-art practice, whether it's using technology or state-of-the-art business model, where they found an interest. They sought me out because they were looking to expand and develop a national practice, trying to help children that have been victimized. And what happened was, since the time I had my own practice with 4 or 5 lawyers, including myself, and we've doubled the size of that practice, more than doubled that, and we're expanding, and the vision is to expand in the states that need us to help individual children as well. And when I say help them, when kids are re-victimized in a child protection system, in other words, they were taken from their parents because of abuse. But then when the kids are re-abused because they are sexually victimized or physically victimized in foster care homes, the problems are exponential, as I talked about earlier before with them. And what we do is we will file lawsuits against the agencies, the private agencies or the public systems that are responsible for these problems. And when we do that, we recover money that we put into special needs trusts or other kinds of trusts or other vehicles to protect this money, so it is there to help these kids with lifelong problems.
And these trusts are not only to protect the money from others, but it's also to protect it from the child, to protect from each other. But I know those are a mechanism by which children can receive the benefit of monies without necessarily losing their entitlement to public assistance benefits that they'd otherwise be entitled to.
That is very true. There's no point in fighting the fight to go recover money if you can't help the children that we represent, and that's exactly what we do. When we meet them the first day or we meet the families the first day, we're there to try to help guide the children into the right kinds of treatment and programming to help them. And if there is a lawsuit, then we try to make recoveries and we do successfully make recoveries that there's enough money to help them the rest of their lives if we're successful.
Howard, it seems to me that Kelley Kronenberg hit the jackpot when they found you and brought you into the practice, because who better than you, focusing on children's rights exclusively as you do, to run that practice? And I take it that you also hit the jackpot with them because they have become a platform that can scale nationally. And I know that how many other states are they in right now?
We're in Illinois, Indiana, New York, Atlanta, Louisiana, and they're expanding. I'm surprised at their footprint. They have 14 offices in Florida. So we have the ability and great reach to help children. And I want to be clear, it's a very narrow niche practice to try to help children that are involved in these systems because they have a corporate heart, a collective corporate heart where they want to make a difference for these kids.
I guess great minds think alike because you just anticipated my next question. So the score is 1-1 on that. How many Howard Talenfelds are there in the United States? Not by name, but by credentials, by commitment, and by focus on this specific area. How many lawyers are there who are like you in this country with that focus and that commitment and that passion to help out those who really have no other voice in our society when it comes to these things?
Sadly, there are very few practices because their folks have not had exposure and don't understand the nature of the magnitude of the problem. But I can tell you this, I've been able to accumulate partners at Kelley Kronenberg. It's been amazing. Justin Gross, Stacy Schmerling, Lisa Hoffman, to just name a few of my partners, are out there. And we'll find the problems, and there's a commitment in my firm to expand and try to help address these problems.
But that started with you, at least as to your firm. And could you share with our listeners a brief history of your professional life and how you ended up in this practice area doing what you're doing now?
That's a long story, a lot of years. Briefly, I had the opportunity, my first firm that I was with 35 years ago with Mike Kolodny, Joel Fass, a former law firm, and for 35 years I practiced with them, and we created a niche practice where I was representing the state of Florida originally, represented HRS, which is now DCF in Florida, Department of Children and Families, and I represented them in all of the class action type litigation that was filed against systems nationally because these class actions are national in scope. More than 20 states are involved in them at any given time. And so I had the opportunity to represent the state of Florida at the time under Governor Childs and Governor Martinez when they wanted to fix the system. And so that was the goal, to try to fix the system even though we were being sued. There came a point in time where I realized that politically there's some governors and secretaries that care more than others, that the only true ability to fix the system is through the advocates on the outside. So I joined the board of the Youth Law Center out of San Francisco and Washington, that group was operating in multiple states as a not-for-profit, trying to help multiple states. And when we created Florida Children's First, which more than 20 years ago, which is a statewide group of child advocates in Florida that are fighting to be the voice for kids in care and trying to help these kids. And we're doing a pretty decent job in Florida, making a difference, passing legislation, getting involved with amicus briefs, and training lawyers that represent kids on what to look for and how to help these kids. And we've been able to expand and become national in scope, and hopefully there are more lawyers that have an interest, getting back to your original question, and wanting to do this kind of practice, because helping kids, there's nothing more satisfying in my life than trying to help kids that lose their parents or temporarily lose their parents and need somebody to be their voice.
Earlier on in my career, I actually represented 2 children who were survivors of sexual abuse by a 15-year-old babysitter whose mother was good friends with their mother. I wonder how they're doing these days, but I remember it was up in St. Lucie County, and we were up there at a hearing, and after the hearing, the court deputy, the bailiff, said something to me which I found really disturbing, and it was very thought-provoking. He said to me, "There must be something in the water up here because this is happening all over the place." Now, St. Lucie County, at least at the time, very rural, quiet, sleepy county. And I was just wondering if there's any correlation that's been demonstrated in the data or in the statistics about where sexual abuse is more relevant or is more prevalent or less prevalent depending on any demographic factors. Kind of a broad question, but can you share anything with us on that?
I can tell you that we have cases throughout every county in the state of Florida where these problems exist because they're universal. COVID doesn't know state boundaries, nor does sexual abuse, nor do many of the other communicable kinds of diseases. And tragically, this is a communicable disease, but people just don't talk about it. And when you don't talk about it, you can't fix it.
I remember back in Florida a long time ago when they had the daycare center. Country Walk. That was a daycare center where there was wide-scale child abuse going on by the Foosters, which were the couple that ran it. They're both doing life in prison now, I believe. Rightfully, special place in hell for them, for sure. But I know that as a result of all of the litigation from all of the families against those people and that daycare center, insurance companies decided to add insult to injury, in my opinion, by creating exclusions for sexual abuse in liability insurance policies. I know it's not completely excluded from all policies, but is that something that has gotten in the way of recovering monies for your deserving clients in some cases, the exclusion?
We'll go beyond insurance policies if we have to, but I can tell you this. In Florida, the legislature passed a statute requiring coverage for these foster care systems. We've run into the exclusion a few times, and we've been able to make recoveries against the agents that have sold those kinds of policies because Florida law mandates that if you're going to be in the business of being a lead agency or being an agency to care for kids, that you have minimum insurance, $1 million, $3 million worth of coverage. And clearly, because sexual abuse is such a prevalent problem when it comes to our child protection systems, any agents that would sell a policy like that to these agencies exposes themselves to their own claims.
So you're talking about errors and omissions, or E&O claims, as we call them,
yes,
against the agents who should have known better and recommended or sold the appropriate coverage, because that is one of the things that they're supposed to be doing.
And we have filed those cases. Yes,
I'm sure. Could you visit with us briefly about other settings? I know that most of your litigation, most of your efforts these days are focused on the foster system or the child protection systems. But what about private individuals, other situations, other scenarios where you have handled and litigated sexual abuse cases on behalf of children?
Sure. We have sued foster parents. We've even pursued them as well across state lines, where they've traveled across state lines individually. Daycare centers, we file those kinds of cases. We file cases against schools where they allow and they're aware that sexual abuse is going on within their classrooms or in their restrooms or somewhere off the premises. We file cases. We filed them against delinquency facilities, group homes. We filed them against residential treatment facilities. Unfortunately, they can happen anywhere that children go. I'm sure we've had a case against anywhere that children go and people that operate them, knowing that sexual abuse is going on underneath their roofs, and we will hold them accountable because we need to help the kids.
And are these problems overall, in your opinion, and based on everything that you've seen, are they increasing on a per capita basis, decreasing, or staying the same, or what can you tell us about that?
I can tell you that, unfortunately, there are not enough lawyers to handle the kinds of cases that we see. I can tell you the data I've seen on sexual abuse where it can be measured has been increasing. We see it because the nature of these systems are such. They're congregate. That means they can spread. And when you put kids into placements with other children that have been victimized themselves, then the capacity exists for the problems to spread.
As my past experience from when I used to practice, for about 10 years I handled cases against the archdioceses. Mostly archdiocese in Miami, but also other archdioceses, that's the plural, and involving basically representing adults who had been molested as children by members of the clergy who were very trusted by these children and their families. You know the rest of that story. Have you done any clergy?
Yes, I've done archdiocese clergy kinds of cases. We just finished one up in Illinois recently. They're happening all over the place, and these kids need help. And they need help as adults, too. There's been a trend nationally, it's a good trend, where there's been an expansion of the statute of limitations, which is the time within which you can file a lawsuit. Florida's got a very harsh one. It's down to 2 years. But if it's sexual abuse, it can be it can be for a lifetime now. And this is happening nationally. New York passed a very liberal law recently. Illinois passed laws. It's happening all over the country. And it's because the problem of child sexual abuse travels with victims through adulthood. They don't want to talk about it. Kids don't want to talk about it. But it haunts them, and it severely impacts so many lives.
And I know that the first real awareness on a national scale of sexual abuse, at least in clergy cases, started in 2000 with the Boston Diocese cases that were filed that made national news. I started getting phone calls when I was practicing from people who just had become aware that this was happening and they were not alone. And I know that really reverberated across the United States for that reason. I also know that for more than 10 years, there have been legislative efforts across the country in different states to wipe out statutes of limitations for sexual abuse survivors. I'm glad they're finally getting there. But what I really found troubling about the opposition to that, who would oppose that? Who was behind that, at least for the Archdiocese? The National Conference of Bishops, which I felt was absolutely horrendous, and it really made my skin curl, and it really energized me and motivated me as a lawyer to pursue these even more vigorously, to get justice for these people. And look who you're up against. Jeff Anderson, who I worked with early on a lot of these cases, he has, as a result of his efforts, I know that many archdioceses have actually sought relief from the bankruptcy courts. But this is a worldwide thing, and my understanding is that in other countries that are not as sophisticated as ours, or maybe third world countries, the problem of sexual abuse is exponentially worse than it even is in the United States, as bad as it is. What's your knowledge about that?
I don't claim expertise. My knowledge, because I understand the pathology behind it, is that how could it not be expanding and exploding, because it's epidemic in its nature. And we probably have more of a grip on it in the United States through Florida Children's First. We've passed laws in Florida that recognize this problem and identify the need for treatment on children, any children that have been sexualized. They require that they be reported to the abuse registry, a 1-800-96-ABUSE number, just to get help.
Right.
Just to get help. They're called special conditions reports. That exists in Florida.
Confidentially, of course.
Yes, and exists in other states in the United States where government has recognized this problem. In 1980, the Congress passed an act called CAPTA, the Child Abuse Prevention Act, and so it requires these statewide registries throughout our country. But I can't tell you comparatively how far that's evolved in Europe, Africa, South America, because we see the problems coming from other nations as well.
But in terms of large organizations, I know that the widespread child abuse has not just happened within the Catholic Church, it's also happened at the hands of corporations. Brad Edwards was with us the other day, and he was talking about one of his cases against Abercrombie and Fitch for child sex trafficking on an international basis. Have you been involved in any of those cases against companies or corporations where it actually becomes part of their culture and it allows them to profit from it, which is right up there on the horrendousness scale with the churches?
I have not been involved in those kinds of cases in corporate America. We read about them, we see them, we know about them. We're focused on the world of child protection, trying to make sure that where children are supposed to be protected, it's safe from re-abuse. And that's what our focus is.
So, Howard, if a genie suddenly appeared, maybe from my crystal ball here, let me rub it. It doesn't work very well, but if a genie suddenly appeared and said to you, Howard, I will give you 3 wishes right now, what would your wishes be as they pertain to what you have dedicated your entire professional career and life to? The protection of children and making things better for them and reducing or eliminating this. What would your 3 wishes be, Howard?
The first wish would be to see transparency, at least in terms of the data and the nature of the problem with these child protection systems, so that folks would recognize the severity of the problem. And the reality is that foster care is a breeding ground for the mentally ill And unfortunately for criminals and criminals on death row, the death row studies, we're all very familiar with the fact that so many murderers, so many folks that end up in our Department of Corrections came out of our foster care system. It is a direct route into those kinds of systems.
So transparency would be the first wish.
One.
What's the second one?
I'd like to see these agencies, Florida privatized its child protection system. And I don't think we're going to let the genie's out of the bottle there. But the problem is they don't work together well. Even though there's a lead agency that hires other agencies to do case management and to do residential care and to do the mental health counseling, the problem is they don't communicate well together. It's hard to get an agency internally to function well on its own. But in the world of child protection, I can tell you, we don't see any examples of where these agencies communicate, can have staffings, can really run the lives of kids, because when you get 3 or 4 agencies involved, to give you a good example, and it's just one example in Florida, you could have Broward Sheriff's Office, which used to investigate abuse and neglect. It just got reclaimed from them. DCF investigates abuse and neglect. They come into the system. The child protection team is part of a Department of Health or another county-run or privately contracted system. They have to talk to each other. Then you have a lead agency like ChildNet or Citrus or any of those agencies around the state, that they have to communicate with those lead agencies who do all the contracting, and some of them reserve the right to make placements or to control the budget or to do case management. And you have case management agencies that are operating separately on their own, and they don't have the resources to approve decisions. And there's a shortage of resources. They're limited. They have their arms tied behind their back. Then you have these mental health agencies. And by the time I'm done counting, we're dealing with 5, 6, 7 agencies who now are all involved in the lives of kids. And if the child is disabled, then you have the Agency for Persons with Disabilities involved. And if the child is medically fragile, it's the Department of Health that's involved. And if the child needs Medicaid, you can't get Medicaid to pay high enough rates to have a quality system. And my wish would be that we really need to pull it back together again and maintain some continuity and some control in these systems so that kids get what they need when they're coming into a system. If they're going to be taken from their parents and they're abused and they're neglected and their lives are going to change dramatically, okay, the state owes them something. And what the something is quality care, a quality placement. They can't lose their schools every time they move from foster care placement to foster care placement. And when you see the averages, even in good states, when a child comes into the system, those children are there for more than 20 months, 2 years. That's probably a pretty good number to go by. You lose a child, they come into the system one day, you're not going to see that child back at home if you're lucky for 20 months or 24 months. And that's a tragedy itself. These agencies don't talk. And unfortunately, these children, and that's my third wish, they all need to have their own lawyer. They all need to have their own eyes and ears and representative and advocate who is skilled protecting them to find them a safe place to be, whether it's back home with their parents, and most of the time it is, get the supports into that home that these parents don't re-abuse the kids, or find these kids a safe alternative placement, like a permanent placement if there's a termination of parental rights, and they need somebody representing them. The irony is in Florida, yes, there's so many great guardians that light them, but you really need skilled advocates to work for these kids to find them a safe place to be. And we don't have that except in the cases that we've been fortunate enough to get legislation, which are disabled kids, victims of trafficking, medically fragile kids, in these narrow categories of kinds of kids that are impacted by the child protection system.
So the delegation of some functions involving the child protection to private industry, I know they've tried that in the prison system as well, right? You're bringing in these outside companies that have a different motive. It's called profit motive. Without getting into too much detail, is that a whole different can of worms that opens up a different set of issues and explains, for better or for worse, some of the behavior and some of the problems that have been caused by those outside companies?
Even though Florida requires these agencies to be not-for-profits, as soon as you've got private entities involved, You have to look in each one of them, and what you find in many cases, some cases, are CEOs that are taking high six-figure salaries from these agencies. The money's got to come from somewhere. And if it ends up in the hands of a brand new structure and system, corporate system, or not-for-profit, they've got to take the money somewhere. And that's money that doesn't make it out there to help the kids. So it's an overhead that unfortunately is depriving kids of precious resources that our legislature already has.
I think a pretty common misperception that the public has about these quote-unquote nonprofits is that all that means is at the end of the year, they don't show a profit. And as a result of that, and maybe because of that, a lot of their executives and the people who work for them get huge compensation, because to leave it in the entity would show a profit, which they're not allowed to do. And that's another reason why having a nonprofit could be a very lucrative thing for the people who run it. And I'm not criticizing all nonprofits. There are many wonderful ones out there, but it's another potential for abuse. And that's just my opinion, but what are your thoughts on that?
This happens. I can tell you in Florida, we've seen CEOs collect almost seven-figure salaries between organizations at times. Now, the legislature's clamped down on that to some extent, and now it's transparent. These agencies have got to disclose on their websites what their CEOs are making, but it's still an issue because you're taking money away from kids that are used for overhead. And overhead, no matter how low you keep it, it can be 10%, it can be 15%, and those are considered to be reasonably low numbers. It's problematic, and yet these same agencies are having huge turnover with their caseworkers. They're experiencing the same problems the public systems before them used to experience. And unfortunately, no matter what the shape of the system is that we've seen in our experience, because they're underfunded, because of the veil of confidentiality, kids don't get what they need. And that's one of the biggest problems in these systems themselves.
Howard, my final question to you, I ask you this for the benefit of all the people out there who have young kids, who are not in the system, and hopefully these parents who do not have problems that will end up sending their children into the system. But this is scary stuff. And I'm sitting here thinking, my kids are growing up now. Thank goodness I don't have this issue directly in front of me as a parent. But for those who do, please look at the camera and give them your best advice about what all of this means to them and what's the best way to keep their kids out of trouble.
That's a really tough question.
That's why I saved it for last.
Because there's so many systems that have been impacted by problems in child protection. The problems that we see pervade our schools, our public schools, our private schools, our daycare, our nursery schools. And they pervade the YMCAs and the religious places where we think that our children are safe. And the ability to make sure your children know good touch and bad touch when they're exposed to things, they're willing to talk to you, you're part of your lives. We have the internet in this day and age where we see traffickers pose as kids and lure kids out of their homes, their regular homes, okay, to be with them. Stay in touch with your kids, love your kids, be aware of what they're doing on the internet, be aware of where they're going, be aware of who their friends are, open your home up, and I say to you, just beware, because these kinds of problems can be lurking anywhere with the most innocent parents that you think are good. You don't know what their kids have been exposed to, and they don't know what their kids have been exposed to. And just be a part of their lives, and that's the best piece of advice I can give.
There we have it. Words of wisdom from a champion and a hero for children everywhere, not just in Florida. And I admire you tremendously, and I thank you for, not only for appearing today, but for sharing this valuable information with everyone who listens to this podcast and beyond. Howard Talenfeld, thank you so much for coming. I want you to know you're welcome to come back anytime. Bring your partners with you. Anytime there's an issue or a case that you want to get out there, this is a really important issue to me and to so many others. Thank you so much, and I really appreciate the time you took to be here.
And thanks for taking the time and understanding to ask the right questions.
And that concludes this episode of the Interesting Lawyers Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.